Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along tonight. Stamp collectors, of course, know all about John Dickinson because of his silk thread paper, which was used initially for Mulready envelopes. But there's a bigger story than that. His company went on to become the largest papermaker and wholesale stationers in the UK. In this talk, I'm going to concentrate on the company during his lifetime. I'm going to look specifically at silk thread paper and then briefly look at what happened to the company after his death and at some of the 20th century philatelic aspects of Dickinson's company. Just to put things in context before we start, Dickinson had a lot of patents for paper making, but he didn't invent machine-made paper. That was actually originally invented by a Frenchman, Louis-Nicole Robert, and his first patent was granted in 1797. But he didn't have the money to finance the development of his ideas. He sold the patent on, and eventually patents were granted to the British engineer Brian Donkin, who, backed financially by the wholesale stationers Henry and Seeley Fourdrinier, built a working machine at Frogmore Mill near Hemel Hempstead, and I will come back to that a little later. John Dickinson was born 29th of March 1782, the eldest son of Captain Thomas Dickinson, RN, a man who had succeeded his father as superintendent of the ordnance at Woolwich. His mother was Frances de Brissac, descended from a French Huguenot family. Papermaking in England at this time was partly run by Huguenot refugees or descendants of Huguenot refugees, so Dickinson grew up meeting friends of his parents, including papermakers, publishers, printers, and stationers. In 1797, on his 15th birthday, he became apprenticed to Thomas Harrison, a stationer at Leadenhall Street, London, on the recommendation of the MP Andrew Strachan, and Dickinson was admitted to the livery of the Stationers' Company in 1804. Setting up in business on his own in the City of London as a stationer, he was helped by family connections. His father's link to the Board of Ordnance helped secure contracts as a paper supplier to them, and the ordnance required paper to manufacture weaponry, including cartridge cases, and Dickinson's paper was used for armaments in the Peninsular War. His father also knew many dignitaries of the East India Company, and by 1806 Dickinson was supplying considerable amounts of paper to them. And he also supplied paper to a number of booksellers and publishers, including Longman and Co. At this stage, Dickinson was only trading as a middleman, selling paper made by others. But from 1803 onwards, he was also experimenting with paper making machinery. Dickinson knew about the Fourdrinier machine. This was named after the brothers that originally financed it. And he may well have bought paper from their Frogmore Mill. And in fact, his very first patent, which was in 1807, was for a device for cutting the web of paper into sheets. So he may have been buying large webs of paper. In 1809, he submitted his first patent for a paper-making machine, and a succession of patents followed dealing with types of paper or improvements to his own machines. And what Dickinson invented was this, which is the cylinder mold machine. What Robert had invented, the Fourdrinier, this is the Donkin patent. It changed quite quickly, but essentially on a Fourdrinier machine, which is still used today, you have a long roll here, and the slurry of paper just goes along this long belt along here and comes off in a roll at the end. So it goes along along a flat belt. What Dickinson invented was the cylinder mold machine, where the pulp comes in there and it's formed round this large cylinder. Dickinson is said to have built and worked on his trial machine in the offices of Andrew Strachan MP, who with George Eyre acted as King's printer, and they later founded the company that became Eyre and Spottiswoode publishers. But experimenting in someone's offices really obviously wasn't really going to get him very far. And in 1809, Dickinson went into partnership with George Longman MP. He came from the family of the publishing house of that name, and he'd already been trading with them. And they started buying up mills in Hertfordshire, mostly centred around Hemel Hempstead, which is about 25 miles northeast of London, so easily within reach of the major trading area. By the 19th century, there had been 12 mills in the county making handmade paper, plus Frogmore, which was the home of the Fodriniers. And Dickinson bought out some of these to expand his machine-made production. He bought Apsley Mill in 1809 and converted it to machine manufacture. And in the same year, he opened a London office at the Old Bailey in the name of Longman and Dickinson. And he kept that as his London headquarters right through until till 1940s, when in fact it got bombed out in World War II. Nash was his second mill, built about half a mile downstream from Apsley, and it was purchased in 1911 because it had more water power than Apsley. And then Batchworth Mill, which is 11 miles to the north, was purchased from the Fodriniers in 1818. Originally a cotton mill, it had been converted to paper in 1755, and he used it for the production of half stuff, which is the name for processed linen rag ready for pulp to use in the production. And that supplied Apsley and Nash Mills. But it didn't stop there. Dickinson bought land at King's Langley to build Home Park Mill in 1825. And a private act of parliament in 1826 was required for the purchase of the land on which Croxley Mill was to be built. And that went into full production in 1830, and by 1838 it was turning out 14 tons of paper a week. There were good reasons for setting up where he did. To run a mill, you need staff, you need water supplies, and you need transport links. And this area south of Hemel Hempstead provided all of them. There's Hemel Hempstead, and there's this range of mills, as you can see down here. The staff came from the villages after which the various mills were named, as well as Hemel Hempstead itself. And Dickinson, in fact, did build some accommodation to house his staff. This picture at the bottom here shows 6 blocks of 4 cottages he had built at Frogmore, which he bought somewhat later on. And he also had cottages built at Nash Mills. And in terms of staffing, I should say, in the Victorian period, in keeping with industry at that time, children were employed as well as men and women. They were eventually legislated for by the 1867 Factory Act. The River Gade, which runs alongside the Grand Junction Canal, so there's the Grand Junction, there's the River Gade down there, provided a regular water supply, and that was needed for the preparation of the raw material, for cleaning the rags as they came in, this sort of things, and for driving the machinery which actually operated the mill. And good transport links were absolutely vital for the mills. They were needed to transport the machinery and the raw materials into the mills and to transport the finished product out. Now, historically, in mills, the transport system would have been pack horses on our very poor roads. But by this time, the Hertfordshire section of the Grand Junction Canal ran past the mills. So there's the Grand Junction there. And the Regent's Canal in London was built to provide a junction with the Grand Junction Canal at Little Venice. Dickinson eventually owned his own fleet of barges and established an office at Battlebridge Station on the Regent's Canal, where barges arrived daily with products from the mills. Those goods which were for export were then sent onwards by the Regent's Canal direct to London docks. And then a little later, construction of the London and Birmingham Railway, that in 1846 it became the London and North Western Railway, began in 1833 and was officially opened in 1837. And in much of Hertfordshire, it pretty well ran alongside the Grand Junction Canal. And in this section, you can see it down here. And from its opening, Dickinson used both rail and barge, and went on using barge, in fact, until relatively late into the 19th century. So I'm going to move on to now to the whole question of the whole story of postal reform, to put Dickinson's work in context. His business was expanding, and then in 1837 he got involved with this whole move for postal reform. In that year, as you know, Rowland Hill had published his pamphlet, Post Office Reform, Its Importance and Practicability, advocating prepayment of postage. And while the pamphlet itself doesn't mention any method of prepayment, shortly after publication, Hill suggested the use of stamped covers. And Dickinson immediately saw an opportunity for his own business. He was a very astute businessman as well as being an engineer. In 1829, he'd patented what was called his silk thread paper, which was a security paper almost impossible to forge, and that was used first in that year for exchequer bonds. And he realised its potential for its use in stamped covers. He made improvements to the method of production, and looking again at this patent of his, what he designed, and this is a slightly simplified drawing from the patent, there were bobbins of coloured thread which went onto this cylinder here. So different coloured threads went from there to there, went round this cylinder as the paper was formed round it, so that the silk threads became embedded absolutely within the paper. They weren't sitting on top, they weren't pressed in, they were embedded in the mesh of the paper. I should just say the term silk thread's always been used by everybody philatelically, because Dickinson's patent, the original patent, refers to cotton, flaxen, or silken thread. But in fact, scientific analysis by Christopher Erland in 1990 proved actually they are all cotton threads. Dickinson used his silk thread paper to produce 2 essays for the prepaid letter sheets, a penny for up to 1 ounce, twopence for up to 6 ounces. And the reaction to Hill's pamphlet led the Post Office to setting up the Commission to Inquire into the Management of the Post Office Department. And Dickinson was one of those called to give evidence, being asked about how his paper was manufactured and how forgeries might be made and detected. And he submitted examples of these essays to the Commission. And the selling point for him was that they were made of silk thread paper, which was pretty well impossible to forge. Then in November 1837, the government set up a parliamentary select committee to examine the whole subject, and Dickinson was also called to give evidence to this, and in this case, in particular, he was cross-examined on the costs of his paper, which was very expensive to make. And as we all know, in 1839, in response to public pressure for postal reform, the government suggested that uniform cheap rates and prepayment by means of what they called a label or a stamped cover should be adopted. And then the Treasury launched a competition to design them and received around 2,600 suggestions. And Dickinson submitted these essays again to that Treasury competition. Well, the reforms, we all know, resulted in the introduction of what were called adhesive labels, i.e. stamps, and prepaid covers. Letter sheets and envelopes were each printed to the value of 1 penny for letters up to ½ an ounce and 2pence for letters up to 1 ounce. They were designed by William Mulready, engraved by John Thompson, and printed by William Clowes. And John Dickinson won the contract for them to be printed on his silk thread paper. The Mulready paper was made in Nash Mills in a special room which was constantly supervised by 2 excisemen. The government were neurotic about the income from these and controlling the security of the whole thing. Both the letter sheets and envelopes were printed, 12 at a time on a large sheet of paper, which was then cut up to produce the single envelope or letter sheet. In both cases, the threads were positioned on the sheet, so they didn't show once the item was folded. And you can see that on the left-hand side here. The fold in the Mulready is there, and this effectively is the back of the Mulready. However, in this example on the right, the threads are misaligned, and the top thread is actually here, and it appears within the design. This is unusual. This is the only copy I've seen. I think they must be fairly unusual, and I assume that there was a incorrect alignment of the printing when those sheets were originally printed, which has meant they're not quite lined up as they should be. Well, we all know the story of the public ridicule applied to the Mulreadys over their design, which resulted in them being withdrawn from sale. They were replaced by embossed postal stationery printed on Dickinson silk thread paper. Penny pink and twopenny blue envelopes were first issued within the twopenny post area of London before being supplied throughout the UK. And there's the letters that went out to postmasters telling them what to expect. Envelopes were introduced nationally in 1841 in 3 different sizes, and letter sheets were introduced in 1844. And they all remained in use on this paper until 1857, after which Dickinson lost the contract to De La Rue, who took over and supplied them subsequently, but on plain paper. Silk thread paper was mostly used for postal stationery, but there are a few examples of it being used for stamps. The earliest example is this one here from 1841. In May that year, Perkins Bacon ran a trial printing of 1-penny stamps on silk thread paper, specifically at the request of Rowland Hill. They used plate 11 of the penny black to print 8 sheets of 240 stamps in red brown, 6 gummed sheets, 2 ungummed sheets. Each sheet had 10 threads of one thread per stamp, with the first and last columns having no threads. These never went into production, partly because of concerns that cutting up stamps containing a strong thread might be difficult, and partly, and I suspect mostly, because there was a concern about Dickinson getting a monopoly over paper supplied to the post office. A lot of big paper makers had been agitating for some years about the fact that Dickinson had been getting the contracts he had, and I think their voices may eventually have been heard. However, in 1847, it was used for the 10 pence and 1 shilling values of Britain's only issued of embossed stamps. 1857, I'm sorry. The engraver, 47. The engraver William Wyon had submitted a rough design, and in that he'd included lines ruled across them, which must have indicated that he expected them to be printed on silk thread paper. And there are a few examples on the continent of this sort of thing. Dickinson granted the paper mill at Passing in Bavaria a license to manufacture silk thread paper, and it was used by Bavaria, it was used by Württemberg, and it was used by Switzerland in 2 different printings. None of these issues lasted for terribly long. So relatively quickly, silk thread paper was not a particularly important part of Dickinson's production, but he did expand rapidly in other areas. One effect of postal reform was a huge increase in the number of letters posted, which rose from around 75 million in 1840 to 196 million within 2 years. And this, of course, created a market for writing paper in envelopes, and it's that became the company's staple for most of the 19th century. The company became very successful, and Dickinson became very wealthy. In 1836, he'd had a new family home built, which he named Abbott's Hill, and that stayed in the family until 1912. He retired from the firm in 1858 at the age of 76. In retirement, his achievements were widely recognised. He was made a Fellow of the Royal Society, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of London, and a member of the Athenaeum Club. He died in 1869, and his obituary was published in all the major newspapers. After his death, the previously owned family firm was incorporated as a limited company, initially with a capital of £500,000. During the early 20th century, the company expanded its distribution with offices in Canada, South Africa, India, Australia, and New Zealand, and they supplied paper to printers and publishers all over the world. We've got an example here of correspondence, for instance, to Netherlands East Indies, as it was. And it expanded in terms of specialist stationery. They'd begun making gummed envelopes in 1850, and by the time it had become a limited company, it was producing 3 million envelopes a week. By 1888, Apsley Mill had built an envelope department which undertook the whole process, making paper, printing, cutting, and gumming. And they offered an increasingly wide selection of envelope sizes and paper types. In 1890, it introduced what it called court mourning stationery, which featured a black triangle at the top of the envelope and the sheet of paper. And this, of course, was a lighter alternative to the traditional mourning stationery, which we're all used to seeing with this heavy black border all the way around the envelope. That branding was first adopted by Dickinson's in 1880, following a suggestion from their Calcutta office that a universal visual symbol was needed to identify Dickinson products. And they adopted the lion brand, which has this symbol of a heraldic lion holding a banner which is inscribed resilience. And they kept that branding for the rest of the time they were in the company went on trading. Millington and Sons were Dickinson's main rival for stationery products. In 1905, in fact, they'd been the only UK company making window envelopes. And in 1911, Millington's launched Basildon Bond, high-quality writing paper made with 30% rag content, which for the time was very high, at a time when most paper was 100% wood pulp content. Dickinson's bought shares in Millington's in 1918, but the two companies continued trading separately until 1931, after which Millington's Tottenham factory closed down and production of Basildon Bond moved to Nash Mills. And from that point on, Basildon Bond was an absolute flagship product for Dickinson's. And who amongst us hasn't had some Basildon Bond writing paper in our past? And of course, the mills had to expand to cope with increased production. This rather charming sketch at the top was done by John Dickinson's young daughter Harriet in 1838. And this photograph underneath, this aerial view, this is of Apsley Mill in around 1930. And you can see work is still going on to expand the site. The earlier production is back here. These two buildings here were a new envelope department, which had been built in 1928. And where they're clearing the land here for building, that was being land cleared for a new card department. The company had also bought more land adjacent to the original site to house a new steam-driven powerhouse. In this period, they also updated infrastructure with connection to the sewage main system and to the National Telephone Company. Dickinson's were barely involved with stamp production before World War II, but there are just a very few examples here where they did produce stamps. Harrison's Somerset House printing of the Edward VII definitives included the sixpence in dull purple, printed on an experimental coated paper which doesn't respond to the silver test. So that's one of theirs. And then in 1912, there was a series of George V Downey Head trials printed on wove paper. There were 8 different papers used in that trial, 7 of them supplied by John Allen of Stowford Mill, but this one example of a very white rag paper was supplied by Dickinson's. And they did also supply paper for all Newfoundland stamps printed between 1932 and 1938. And that brings us to World War II. The outbreak of war for all paper suppliers caused enormous problems. Like many other industries, they had to contend with shortages, with rationing of raw materials, and with price controls. And government legislated constantly to try and preserve the paper industry by controlling every aspect of its production, of the materials used, of the quantity and quality of materials, and so on. And this is one example of a statutory rule, in this case, on the salvage of waste paper to support the paper and pulp industry. And you could be fined a lot of money if you didn't save your paper. So for Dickinson's, the World War II meant a complete change of focus. In 1941, it became a protected establishment undertaking at least 80% of government business. The engineering department was given over to munitions production, and the card and envelope departments engaged in light engineering governmental works, as well as producing envelope production needed for the war. And one of the things that they did were these active envelopes. The honour, as you all know, the honour envelopes here worked that the officer concerned signed the form to say the contents contained only private information, but they did sometimes also pick up censors, in fact. Most active service envelopes you see have no indication of producer, but 3 companies did actually have their details printed on them, and that included Dickinson's. On each envelope, you see this little thing here, JD & Co. Apsley. And they look hugely different on this slide because Dickinson's, like all the others, were contending with a shortage of raw material, lower quality of the raw material, so you get different coloured papers and different coloured inks for that reason. The airgraph system, which in USA was called V-mail, was introduced in 1941 to facilitate correspondence to and from troops, while saving space and weight on the aircraft carrying the correspondence. System worked by the sender writing their message on a blank printed form. That was then photographed at the sending end of the route and reduced to strips of microform, which you can see here, and the negative sent by air to the destination end, where they were printed out, looked like this, and then delivered. The whole system was devised by the British Post Office using the Kodak microfilm system Recordac, which had been used for businesses such as banks since the 1930s. In 1943, Dickinson's cooperated with the Post Office and Kodak to speed up the system. They devised a machine to make the window envelopes and insert the printed message in one production. The Post Office adopted the system, and by Christmas 1943, 2 million items a week were being sent. And then after the war, the company resumed manufacturing its pre-war products, including Croxley writing paper, which had been around for many years. And as you can see, it was advertised in a South African booklet of 1948, and you can see it featured here on a Queen Elizabeth II airmail, advertising it there as well. So they pretty well went back to the same things as they'd been doing before the war. Then in 1950, Dickinson saw a marketing opportunity when London held its first post-war international stamp exhibition. The exhibition, of course, should have been held in 1940 to commemorate the centenary of postal reform, but World War II intervened and instead it was held in 1950. Dickinson's produced the official souvenir cover, and that had an insert of this stiff card reproducing a Mulready envelope on the front and some advertising information about Dickinson's on the back. There was also this souvenir sheet printed by Waterloo's, which you could order to be sent off in one of these envelopes at the price of 2 shillings for home or sea mail, 3 and 6 for air mail. These tend to be sold separately these days, and if you haven't seen them, they are lovely. They're a beautiful piece of printing which very accurately reproduce the classic designs they've chosen on this sheet. And while their primary output was a whole range of commercial stationery, Dickinson did still retain a small interest in philatelic products. They made a number of registered envelopes for various Commonwealth countries. In some cases, they had a blind embossed imprint on the back, which that one has, which I've totally failed to manage to reproduce on here. You can't really see it, but that's another design there for South Africa a little later, and you can see there the imprint is under the flap. They also produced aerograms for the air letter service, which had been introduced in the late 1940s, and that used their Apsley air letter branding. And these are all stamped to order forms. And then they also produced unstamped air letters as well for a number of Commonwealth countries. It says down here, form approved by the Postmaster General, and there were rules that they had to conform to, covering weight, printing, opacity, paper, and the general appearance. So you'll see those very commonly. The company's independence ended in 1966 when John Dickinson and Co. merged with ESA Robinson of Bristol to form the Dickinson Robinson Group. And this became one of the largest stationery and packaging companies in the world. But then during the 1990s, parts of the company were sold off and production was rationalised. There was, for a short period, rebranding of part of the business, rebranded as John Dickinson Stationery, and they produced this rather nice clock, which I've got sitting behind me actually, commemorating the event 200 years of Dickinson's company. But of course, the company disappeared completely eventually. Croxley Mill closed in 1980, Apsley Mill closed in 1999, and Nash Mills closed in 2006. And the whole area is now mostly housing and commercial developments. Dickinson doesn't have a presence in the area, but he is still very much remembered. Frogmore Paper Mill, where mechanised paper first started, is now an industrial museum and archive, can normally be visited. It's been closed this year for problems, but usually you can go and see it and see how paper used to be made. And then in 1999, the local newspaper produced this supplement to mark the end of an era, the end of the John Dickinson story. And that's where my story ends. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Wendy. That's really very good. Thank you very much.